welcome everybody to Fireside Chats with Candidates. I'm Joy Short, and our co-hosts today are Ellen Polivy and David Liston, and our special guest is Eliza Orlins, who's running for Manhattan District Attorney. So welcome, Eliza.
Thank you. Thanks for having me tonight. I'm so happy to be here with all of you.
So happy to have you here. So everybody, Eliza is the only public defender running right now for Manhattan, for the Manhattan District Attorney spot. And I think you've been a public defender for about a dozen years. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but I started back in 2009 and have been a public defender my entire career.
Wow. And I think you mentioned that you've handled maybe about 3,000 cases.
Yep. I've represented over 3,000 people charged with crimes here in Manhattan who couldn't afford to hire an attorney. And, you know, when people think about being a public defender and they think about you have the right to an attorney, if you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you. And that's me, of course. And they think about it in terms of, oh, these are these big, huge, serious crimes that are coming through and you're representing people accused of, you know, very gruesome, big, you know, people think about the media depiction of what it looks like to be a public defender or to be in criminal court every day. But the overwhelming majority of cases that come through are low-level offenses or clients who've been arrested for jumping a turnstile or laying down on a park bench.
What actually are your three top priorities on your platform? And can you tell us what you're going to do about them?
Definitely. So as I mentioned, you know, most of the cases that come through, about close to 75% of those cases are cases that are, you know, really low-level cases. They're violations, they're misdemeanors. You know, clients who've been arrested for taking up 2 seats on the subway, literally putting their groceries on the seat next to them in an uncrowded subway car when they are headed home from work, and getting arrested for things like that. You know, that's not keeping our city safe. It's not promoting equity and justice, and it's wasting taxpayer money. And so, you know, really thinking about how to decrease the footprint of the Manhattan DA's office, you know, really declining to prosecute the overwhelming majority of these low-level offenses that are crimes of, you know, poverty or mental health or substance use disorder, or just offenses that really should never be in the criminal legal system to begin with. And so that would be number one. You know, number two would be ending money bail. Right now, we have a system in place where we claim that there's this presumption of innocence for those who, you know, that exists for everyone who's charged with a crime. And yet you really only get the benefit of the presumption of innocence if you can afford to buy your freedom, if you can pay to get out of jail while your case is pending. Meanwhile, my clients have been held in jail on as little as, you know, $250 bail for days, weeks, months, or years, because they couldn't afford to pay a few $100s. They've been coerced into pleas, gotten worse sentences, you know, lost their jobs, their homes, their children. And this system of wealth-based detention is unjust. It's not keeping us safe. It's not living up to the purpose that bail is supposed to serve, which is to make sure that someone returns to court. It's just perpetuating these inequities, and there are better ways of really making sure someone comes back to court. There are less restrictive alternatives. And so ending money bail is a huge part of my platform as well. You know, all of these things kind of fall under the overarching theme of decarceration, rather than just perpetuating the status quo and continuing this horrible cycle of mass incarceration. And they all stem from my experience as a public defender. And so the third thing kind of is like the other side of the same coin, because really what the Manhattan DA's office has primarily done is over-prosecute and over-incarcerate people like the people I've represented, you know, lower income folks, people of color, people who are LGBTQIA, people with disabilities, those who are the most vulnerable to begin with, while turning a blind eye to the crimes that are committed by those who are wealthy and powerful and well-connected. And so the other, you know, the third thing is really just making sure that we are holding accountable people who have power, essentially. So I'm talking about police officers, creating a police accountability unit that holds police officers accountable when they commit not just brutality in the streets, but false arrests, falsifying paperwork, perjury in the courthouse, which is a thing I've seen as a public defender. And then also holding corporations accountable, protecting workers, holding people accountable who are violating environmental laws. People talk a lot about violence, but they don't talk about slow violence. They don't talk about, the deterioration of air quality or mold or lead paint that is leading to the marginalization of so many New Yorkers. So, declining to prosecute, not prosecuting, low-level offenses, but holding accountable those who commit serious crimes, and ending money bail are probably my top three things that I would mention, although there are so many to go through.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned accountability, because it calls to mind what went on today in Jean Kim stepping forward and accusing Scott Stringer of sexual harassment. What did you think of that? And is it something that you feel would have been something that could be prosecuted had the claim come forward, within the statute of limitations?
Well, weighing in on whether or not there should be a prosecution for allegations that are decades old, I think is not necessarily something that I should really be saying. But I believe Jean Kim. I think she was very brave in coming forward. I think that for far too long, for centuries, in fact, New York has really been the breeding ground for these old boys clubs that protect powerful men and allow them to act with impunity and have other men protect them. And so, we've seen this over and over again, this pattern that repeats itself. We've seen this with Eric Schneiderman and with everyone who propped him up. We've seen this with Governor Cuomo and now with Scott Stringer, and no more. It's time for a change. And amazingly, the people who've been the most vocal, who've called these things out, who've been so brave are women. And it's long past time to have New York City led by women, in the DA's office, as mayor, et cetera. We've never had a woman as Manhattan District Attorney, and it is long overdue.
Well said. What do you think, Dave? Should we have?
Sorry, Dave. I mean, it's time.
Yeah.
Did you hear me disagree? I don't know why.
Don't hear you disagree. Okay, folks.
I think that would be an unfair assumption to assume I would disagree with you on that. And I applaud you. I was at the DA's office for many years, and I've also been a defense lawyer. I've done a lot of work a lot of pro bono defense work. I've also done a lot of criminal defense work. So much of what you've said resonates. I also know that when I was at the DA's office, I had tremendous respect for the lawyers at Legal Aid. I actually thought that we were coming at some of the same problems from different angles, but we were there to try to solve some of the same problems. One of the reasons I chose to be a prosecutor is why you're running, because I believed, and I think you do too, that we can make positive changes from the inside. So I have tremendous respect for what you've done and for the reasons why you're running. Now, having said all that, I will say, sometimes, so here's a quote from that you said this at an interview March 17th, 2021 with Gotham Gazette. What prosecutors do every day to the people whom I represent is cruel and inhuman and plainly wrong. I've worked with a lot of prosecutors, and I've been opposite many prosecutors, and I'm sure I've seen, and I suspect you have too, that prosecutors are people too, many of whom were drawn to that work for the same reasons you're drawn to it. They actually believe, whether it's naive or not, that they can make a difference. So I wonder, do you think, is that a little harsh, what you said? And then the second question, if you're elected, you will lead this office. You will be in charge of over 500 prosecutors who've made that decision to be prosecutors. And presumably you're going to need to work with them. How will you accomplish that if on day one people think you think of them that way? I have a feeling you don't, and that's why I'm asking the question, so you can clarify.
Well, I appreciate that. And yes, as someone who has defended over 3,000 cases, all against assistant district attorneys in the Manhattan DA's office, I've worked with that office. I've worked with, police officers. I've worked with investigators. And, as the only public defender in this race, I think you can call people in the DA's office. They know that I'm tough. I'm going to stand up for my clients, but I'm someone who has, an excellent relationship with a lot of assistant district attorneys there. And to be frank, a lot who have left the Manhattan DA's office or people who are trying to leave the Manhattan DA's office currently, who are interviewing for other jobs because they have found that working under this old guard mentality has been unbearable. That one of the arguments that they have to have, and this is something that has thankfully come to the forefront, and these conversations are really happening to the point where a public defender like me can be able to even run for Manhattan District Attorney, but that, I understand that my statements are a bit polarizing at times, and it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone there, of course. And I have wonderful friends and mentors who've been there, including my law school trial advocacy coach, who always tried to convince me to come to the DA's office instead of the public defender's office. And a dozen years later, I'm like, look at me, I'm finally going to come to the DA's office. But the reality is that because of the overwhelming majority of the cases that are prosecuted in the Manhattan DA's office, and the way in which they've defaulted to always trying to bring the highest charges, to coercive plea bargaining tactics, to trial tax, to hearing tax, my clients can't even challenge the constitutionality of a search against them without risking years in state prison. Where is the justice in that? And to be in an office that has been so regressive and punitive in that way, does lead to me being able to say in a general sense that what prosecutors do every day is cruel and inhumane. The way in which we use incarceration in not just New York City, but in this country is systemically racist. It's not keeping us safe. It's really destroying lives, tearing families apart, ruining communities. And it's not actually doing anything to repair harm, if harm was even done in some of these situations. And so, I'm ready to apply the experiences I've had as a public defender to running that office. And I understand that, it's going to be a monumental task for whomever takes it over. But I do want to make sure that these same patterns and mistakes and the status quo doesn't just perpetuate, because, I do think that one of the most important things is coming to the right side of history here, is having these conversations about the racism that has existed within our criminal legal system, within policing, within the ways in which the war on drugs has perpetuated, for example, that we know that thankfully marijuana has finally been legalized in New York, but we know that Black people and white people use marijuana at equal rates, and yet you are 6 times more likely to be arrested and prosecuted and jailed for it if you are a person of color. That is just outrageous. And so, yeah, to have participated in that, so many of the good prosecutors I knew at the Manhattan DA's office left that office because they couldn't stand that they couldn't offer alternatives to incarceration and were forced to seek prison sentences in all cases.
You've mentioned a few times you've represented 3,000 people. When I was at the DA's office, I probably met with 3,000 victims, crime victims, many of whom were poor, many of whom were minorities, many of whom might be people you represented.
I was going to say, I bet half of them were overlapping. People talk about people who perpetrate crimes and people who are victims of crimes as though they are two separate and distinct buckets or groups of people, when in the reality is it's a Venn diagram that's almost entirely overlapping. So many of my clients were victims in cases where the DA's office was calling me to say, listen, I know your client's charged with something, but we need to talk to them because they were the victim of a shooting or a stabbing or, we're talking about serious violent crimes here. And so, of course, I too have met with victims and spoken with them and understand what they go through and how horrible the criminal legal system is for them as well. I don't think that anything that is being done right now is repairing the harms that have been done to them either.
Right. Here's a question for you. How do I put this? you, and you're not the only candidate to do this. Several candidates have pronounced various crimes that they will not prosecute. Um, and frankly, if I were asked to make a list of crimes I would not prosecute, I might agree. But I'm going to take a step back. Is it really the role of a prosecutor to make that decision? You're not running for state legislature. When I listen to you, sometimes I think you should, because a lot of what you're talking about is actually decriminalizing things that, for better or worse, are crimes. And we, in this country, we all believe, and I know you believe, in separation of power. And laws are made by legislatures. Crimes and laws are prosecuted by prosecutors. And I'm not picking on you. You're not the only one.
No. I don't feel picked on. I think that, prosecutorial discretion is obviously a thing, and prosecutors are elected for a reason. And when was the last time that adultery was prosecuted here in New York? When does abortion get prosecuted here in New York? I mean, there are laws on the books, obstruction of a park bench. Have you ever laid down on a park bench or put a bag on the subway seat next to you?
So if I may just finish the question, if I could
sure.
Yeah, thanks. Understood. You bet. Adultery is not prosecuted. Neither should be, in my opinion, people sleeping on the subway. Having said that, shoplifting, vandalism, gambling, misdemeanor possession of drugs, buy and bust, these have been prosecuted. They are on the books. Do you think is it appropriate for a prosecutor to make that decision? And let me be clear, I'm all for prosecutorial discretion. So once someone is prosecuted, lots of decisions need to be made, right? How hard to prosecute, what alternatives there are to incarceration. There are lots of ways to deal with this and hopefully make it a positive thing. But to say I will not prosecute, and I'm not sure if that is what you're saying, so that's, maybe you can clarify that. But at least a few candidates have said, I will not prosecute the following crimes. And look, Cy Vance did it the other day too. So it seems to become a thing people are doing. And I'm just asking this question. A, is it a good idea to categorically declare certain crimes off limit? And let me give you an example. Let's say I own a small business and I'm struggling and someone comes into my store and shoplifts. Someone vandalizes the store. Someone decides to deal drugs out of aisle 3 in my store. Will you not prosecute those cases?
Okay, well, there are a lot of questions in there. I wanted to let you get through it. So, there, as we talked about, so there is prosecutorial discretion. And when the police decide who to arrest, it's the prosecutor who then decides what to do with that arrest, whether to prosecute and what charges to bring. And prosecutors, really serve as gatekeepers quite regularly in deciding which cases to bring and not to bring. So the idea that this should be a role only determined by a legislature is not historically the case at all. There's no possible way a prosecutor could bring every single case, even if he or she wanted to. And so I think there are I understand the myriad of concerns that are expressed by people who want to fearmonger about public safety. The New York Post, of course, and Fox News have certainly latched onto the fact that a few of us in this race have, in fact, said that we should be declining to prosecute a number of low-level offenses. I think that for a very long time, a lot of prosecutors, before marijuana was legal in New York, were saying we're not going to prosecute simple possession of marijuana. I think that thankfully it finally passed this legislative session, but the only reason that marijuana legalization didn't happen in New York sooner was arguments over budgetary allocations and where the money should go from this new revenue, this new business. So the idea that because of that, we should continue prosecuting something that is not a public safety concern, that is disproportionately impacting communities of color. The war on drugs in its entirety, not just marijuana, has been a war on people, and predominantly Black and brown people. And so the idea that we should perpetuate this relic of, that really exists because of systemic racism to disenfranchise, communities of color and continue to basically perpetuate white supremacy is to me something that's a non-negotiable. Yes, I have stated that in the most exceptional circumstances, there are certain misdemeanors that are on my, decline to prosecute list that I will prosecute. But, in the majority of cases, those are not things that are keeping us safe. It's an overwhelming waste of taxpayer money. It's systemically racist. And now, thankfully, I'm not just saying these things. Like, there are actual longitudinal studies that show us that this is the case. Thankfully now we are coming to a point in time where prosecutors are getting elected who are making these categorical decisions to say, here is the list of crimes I am not going to prosecute. I'd give you the example of Rachel Rollins in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, in Boston, and she had a list of 15 low-level offenses that she was no longer going to prosecute. And the National Bureau of Economic Research did a longitudinal study, because thankfully now she's been in office long enough that they could really look at the impacts of her making these decisions, these declinations, these non-prosecutions, if you will. And what they found was that by not prosecuting these offenses, it made it less likely that the person was going to have future contact with the criminal legal system. So in the inverse, when you prosecute these cases, these victimless crimes, if you will, you are actually making it more likely that a person will have future contact with the criminal legal system. And it makes sense if you really think about it, because when someone's arrested, even if they only spend a few days in jail, maybe they lose their job, they can't pay their rent, they lose their home, they lose their children to foster care potentially if they're a single parent. And I've seen this. I've seen the way just one arrest, one accusation, not even a conviction, can destroy someone's life. I've seen it, with clients of mine. And so, yeah, there are, of course, concerns about making sure that people have access to treatment for substance use disorder and access to the help that they need. But I think in terms of prosecuting these low-level offenses, we now know that it actually will keep our communities safer, and that we won't be spending the taxpayer money that it costs $1,266 a night of taxpayer money to put someone on Rikers Island. So, in terms of prosecutorial discretion and making sure that we are protecting our communities, that will be my obligation to the voters of Manhattan, to make sure I'm doing everything in my power to keep them safe. And that means not prosecuting these low-level offenses.
Thank you.
So, David, I'm going to move the torch over to Ellen in just a second. But before I do that, you got your torch there. Okay. Before I do that, Eliza, you'd mentioned that there's better ways to ensure that people are going to come back to court other than simply cash bail. So before we move on from that subject, I'd really like to hear what your recommendations are.
So, we're supposed to be using the least restrictive means, the least restrictive alternatives available to make sure someone returns to court. One step down from money bail is electronic monitoring, which is still, quite an intrusive thing into people's liberty, but you can monitor people's location, GPS monitoring. There is supervised release where there are required in-person check-ins, phone check-ins, et cetera. There are personally secured appearance bonds. There are so many other things available to us. They do those things in the federal system, and they see that, upwards of 95% of people are still returning to court for their scheduled court dates. And it results in, a much more just outcome of cases.
So it doesn't seem to be negatively impacting the ratios in terms of returning to court, getting people
correct.
To court. Cool. So Ellen, you're up.
All right, here we go. This is my torch.
Here you go.
Right. So I read all 60 pages of your platform statement, and really interesting. On the idea of keeping people out of decarceration, and not just keeping people coming back to court, but also keeping people out of jail permanently. What are your ideas? What are the alternatives to incarceration when somebody actually perpetrated a crime? It might have been a mid-level crime. You don't want to put them in jail. for all the reasons you stated. What other options do you have?
Well, so as a public defender, I've seen so many clients come through our criminal legal system who really were people who were suffering from mental health issues or substance use disorder. And, really, even in circumstances where we would beg the Manhattan DA's office for an opportunity for an alternative to incarceration, oftentimes they would meet with my client, have multiple what they called proffers, where I'd have to bring my client in, they'd question them, they'd make them sign a HIPAA release and turn over all previous medical records. And then, of course, the DA's office would say, oh, we don't think this person is worthy of treatment. They won't even get the opportunity to participate in one of these, diversion courts or specialty courts. And it was always so devastating to me, these opportunities for an alternative to incarceration should really be the default. That should be the norm, not the exception. And so making sure that people have access to treatment for mental health issues and substance use disorder. And, I think even thinking about restorative justice practices, so much of what our criminal legal system does right now is if someone burns down your house, the criminal legal system can go over to their house and take a torch to it and burn down their house too. But you're still standing there looking at the ashes where your house used to be and saying, oh, okay, now their house is burned down too, but now what? Because it doesn't actually think about repairing harm. It doesn't actually do anything to make victims whole again. And so really focusing on restorative justice practices when victims are given the opportunity, are given the option to opt in to restorative justice practices, 90% do, which is a staggering number.
Right. Okay. Can you explain what restorative justice is in a nutshell?
Of course. So restorative justice is, thinking about accountability without necessarily, just utilizing incarceration. It's thinking about how we can make a victim whole again. I will try and keep it really brief. I'm going to tell like a 60-second story, but Danielle Sarad tells it extremely well. She runs Common Justice. She wrote an unbelievable book called Until We Reckon. And she runs this restorative justice program and talks about this time when she did it. And this man who was the victim of like a pretty violent, I think, knife point robbery, was experiencing pretty severe PTSD subsequent to the robbery. And they were able to find the perpetrator. The person had admitted guilt, accepted responsibility. And this man who was the victim was experiencing, very severe PTSD, wasn't leaving his home, was really couldn't go to his job, was like experiencing panic attacks when he went out every time someone was near him. And they asked him if he wanted to participate. And he said, sure, why not? Like, my life is not great right now. And they brought them together in a room and had them kind of communicate with each other. And the man who had perpetrated the crime said, my brother, my father, my grandfather, every man in my family has been in prison. And I knew one day I would be there too. And this is how I learned to survive on the streets. And I didn't really give much thought to you. And the victim said, well, this is how it has impacted my life, what you did, and this is the ways in which it has affected me. And they kind of shared this thing. And the perpetrator says, man, but you never learned to defend yourself. You never learned anything. And he was like, yeah, I guess. And he's like, I could teach you, because they're supposed to come up with a way of kind of coming together. And he said, oh, okay. And so Danielle says, oh my gosh. And we're like, oh God, what are we doing here? And they bring them to this boxing gym one day. And he's like, all right, man, now you come up behind me. The perpetrator's like, okay, come grab me from behind. And he's like grabbing him. And he's like, all right, you get out like this. You like pull and twist. And here's how you escape. Now do it again, do it again, do it again. And he's like, okay, harder. And he's like, okay, now let's switch. And so not only is this man who's been so traumatized by this being held in the position that he was held in when he was robbed, but it's by the person who actually did this to him. And he's like, all right, I'm going to do it lightly. Now try and get out, try and get out, try and get out. And by the end, he's holding him pretty tightly. And the man's able to escape. And he teaches him how to kind of defend himself. And, they all go home at the end of the day. And Danielle says the next day she gets a call from the victim. And he says, Danielle, you're not going to believe this. I went outside today and I felt nothing. And I know that might not sound like much, but this is someone who'd been experiencing, really severe panic attacks when he went outside. And he's like, so I ran to the most crowded place I could think of. I ran to Times Square. And there were people coming at me from every direction, and I wasn't scared anymore. I felt nothing. I felt okay being outside again. And so thinking about restorative justice practices is thinking about how to provide accountability, and without necessarily, just perpetrating the harms of mass incarceration, and thinking about, if someone's not getting locked up forever, they're going to come out and it's just going to result in a re-offense cycle. And, then of course, both people are provided services and therapy and all of the help that they need and support. But it's really just thinking about a different way of addressing harms and providing accountability that actually repairs the harm that has been done for everyone.
Great.
And I'm sorry, that story was like 3 minutes, not one. But it's such a good story.
I needed to hear that. That was a
You're
great
invested.
All right. So you focus a lot about data analytics, and I think you're maybe the only person that I've read that talks about data analytics. And it's a great idea. What gave you that idea?
So I'm lucky enough to be working with a brilliant criminologist who I've talked to about this issue, because one of the things of being a public defender is that when I was working on a case, let's say someone was charged, a client's charged with like an assault 2 or something, and I say to the DA, hey, is it possible to get an offer of a disorderly conduct? And they say, no, we don't do that. Categorically, we never make a discon offer on an assault 2. I'm like, never? So I'm sitting there, and the way that I would have to find out is like, I'd send an email to my legal aid hey, everyone, has anyone ever gotten an offer of a discon on an assault 2? If so, can you please send me the indictment number or whatever, docket number? And people would have to write back and they'd be like, yeah, I got one, blah, blah, blah. And that shouldn't be how we figure out whether or not something is done. Like, there should be transparency and accountability on the part of the DA's office, not just to the, what crime is charged, what plea is offered, what sentence is sought, but the racial, gender breakdowns of all of these cases, so that we can actually know what is happening in the DA's office. It's offensive how unbelievably opaque the Manhattan DA's office is, and they don't release a case-by-case breakdown. There's no transparency whatsoever. And so really thinking through how to not just be transparent, but do it in such a way that it's accessible to Manhattanites, and that I make sure that my policies are such that I have a chief policy scientist on board who can analyze these things and make sure I'm living up to these promises I'm making about, the ways in which I want to change the Manhattan DA's office.
Okay, how about if we shift the torch right? Whoops, almost lost my torch.
Oh my gosh, you all have torches.
Yes, we do. We're kidding about it being a fireside chat. Problem is, we don't have any fireplaces on Roosevelt Island, so we have our.
I have one.
torches.
This is my fireplace behind me.
There you go. Well, now we'll be using, maybe the next time we'll be using your fireplace. Never.
Right. Who are we switching to?
So, David, how about if we switch that torch right back to you?
Eliza, one time, one of the candidates turned the tables on me and said, what was the best advice that you got while you were at the Manhattan DA's office? And I first of all, I just thought it was great that she turned the tables. But two, I thought it was a really good question. And I thought, I'm going to use this someday. And so I'm ready to use this with you. You've been with legal aid a long time, and you've mentioned mentors, and I appreciate how valuable mentors can be to us, to anyone, right? What's the best advice you've been given, and how would you apply it to the role of DA?
Whew, that's a good question. I love that somebody turned that on you. That's such a good one. And I think that, the best advice I've ever gotten. I mean, I think that I have always taken my cues from the people I've looked up to, from the time that I was an intern at legal aid, when I was 20 years old, and knew that one weekend that this was what I wanted to do with my life. This was it. I was going to be a public defender. I was going to do it for the rest of my life, that it was the only job I was going to apply to. It was the reason I was going to law school. And it was, I think it was something that was instilled in me from a young age, just to always, stay true to yourself, to always speak up on behalf of, people who don't necessarily have the same privilege that you do. I recognized from a very young age the privilege that I had, even just because of the color of my skin, because my sister's adopted. And so having a sister who, growing up, experienced racism in a way that I never did. Like, I would go pick her up from her classroom in elementary school and she'd be crying. And I would say, what happened? And she's like, oh, there was this boy in my class who was very racist to me today, and like would repeat things to me that were said to her. And I was like, what? And so recognizing like very, very early on just how unbelievable of a privilege it was to even just be a white person, and to use that privilege to like weaponize it for good, to fight for those, who don't necessarily have that, and to always stay true to yourself and really stand up for what you believe in. And that's why like I have been, I would say, remarkably consistent. A lot of people are like, oh, I came around to these positions of, we should decriminalize sex work and end mass incarceration. I'm like, nope, I've been 100% consistent, my entire adult life. I think the first time I ever tweeted publicly about sex work, for example, was in 2010, which, to say it was an unpopular opinion to hold in 2010 doesn't quite, I don't think, encapsulate just how unpopular it was. And it now is something that Cy Vance himself said, I'm no longer going to prosecute sex workers. And it was just, I was quoted in that article in the New York Times about that, because this is something I have been extremely outspoken on for, over a decade. And it's just, it's amazing to see how far the conversation has come. But that these are the positions that I've always held dear, and to really have stayed true to myself, and just be so grateful that the moment is now, that our country is really coming to this reckoning with all of these injustices that have occurred for too long.
What's the best advice you got? I'm going to hold you to the question.
And
think about a mentor, or while you've been at Legal Aid, someone must have given you some good advice, and I'm just curious what it was.
I think it's like always, I think probably, my mentor at Legal Aid, she would always say to me that, always just say what you believe, even if it's not popular. And so I think like really it was, that's kind of what I was describing, that like speak up even when the opinion doesn't seem popular, because now everyone is like mimicking my talking points. Like they're saying the things that I've always said, and they're very new to saying them. But, I think that's the best advice I've ever gotten, because I've always been consistent. I've always been true to myself. I've always fought for what I believed in, even when it was not popular to do so.
What's a question that we should ask? Now I'm going to have you come up with a question that I can ask the next candidates. What's a good question for us to ask the other candidates? How they can,
if these are, I'm running against, obviously, a number of career prosecutors. And I think asking how they reckon with the harms that have been caused by their respective offices, and ask them, what will make them different than their predecessors who came before them, who have maybe made progressive promises while they were campaigning and then remained the primary driver of mass incarceration of people of color, and how they will, combat that, and how we should believe them that they will actually do the things that they're promising during this campaign, because I think it's become quite popular to make these statements, these progressive promises. And, as the only public defender and the only person who's really remained true to all of these things, never wavered, never equivocated on any of them, I want to know, or I think you should want to know, I think voters should want to know how we can trust these people to live up to the promises they're making during these campaigns.
That's a good question.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So Ellen, we're heading back to you.
Okay. That's great.
Sorry,
All right.
Eliza has no idea why we're doing this. I think she thinks we're crazy.
We are.
No, I love it. I love it.
A little humor here.
Explain. It doesn't have something to do with FDR or the Fireside Chat.
No, I know what we're doing.
Okay.
We are Roosevelt Island after all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so as a social worker, I used to work in an emergency room, and the guys would come in. It was near the Bowery. They would come in and tell me that they broke a window in a federal building because they got better meals in the federal court in federal jails. So somehow it was they saw jail as a place to go to get away from being homeless.
Wow.
So sometimes incarceration is better than living on the street. I just wanted to point that out. I don't know if that's true, but it's pretty sad if that's the case. I want to get back to, you mentioned you had a big section on toxic mold. And I know a little bit about toxic mold. I had a friend who just went through it. She was evicted from her apartment for a year while the apartment, the co-op bickered with her about who was responsible for the mold in her apartment. And basically she was paying for 2 apartments, her apartment and another room that she had to live in during COVID. And now she's finally given up and told them, do whatever you want, fix it however you want. And now she's stuck trying to sell the apartment, but now she might be responsible for the mold that's in her apartment, that's still in her apartment.
Oh my gosh.
That was caused by a leak. So the problem that I have is when you're holding somebody accountable for toxic mold, who is the person you would be holding responsible? Because who was the cause of this mold? You know, there's mold in every building somewhere. You know, you have a leak, it's going down the walls. There's going to be mold somewhere, and it's going to show up in somebody's apartment. So then how do you determine who was the cause of the mold and who fixes it? And then, you know, it's so complicated, and mold mitigation is so expensive that nobody can afford it. So, you know, certainly one person can't afford it. One apartment owner can't afford it. So, and a building may not be able to afford it either. So then who pays for this? And like, do you put somebody in jail for it? Like, what's the penalty for holding a landlord accountable or somebody accountable? And what if it was the tenant that caused the mold problem because they left the water running? Yeah. So I know that there's so many different options. Like, how do you make the decision and who do you hold accountable?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sorry for what your friend went through / is still going through. I think, you know, there are so many of these issues that continue to go on. And, you know, I've had friends who've experienced mold and have experienced, you know, long-term chronic sickness from the mold in their apartments. And it's really quite horrendous. And so one of the things that we focus on is not just the mold itself, but it's this disturbing pattern of these false certifications and false statements from building owners and developers regarding compliance with these local laws. And so, you know, making sure that it's not just the mold that we're talking about that is the issue, because mold, of course, is an issue, but that may not be a criminal issue, but it's the false certifications, the lying about it, that, you know, these crimes that are committed that are concealing these issues that exist, that is what becomes, you know, an issue that then I think that warrants the DA's office getting involved. You know, this causes chronic health problems, neurological damage, you know, a lifetime of respiratory issues, and can drive families into spirals of poverty, et cetera. But I don't know that there is, you know, I do think that we should be cracking down on some of these issues in terms of the ways in which they're investigated by the city. But the way in which the DA's office can really get involved is in making sure that people aren't filing or being held accountable if they do file false certifications.
So I'm going to just remind everyone that you can put a question in the chat if you'd like. We only have just a couple of minutes left with Eliza. So if you have a question that we haven't hit upon and you'd like to ask it, then by all means, just write it in the chat. So I have a question for you, Eliza. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there is a new bill that's been proposed by Assemblymember Rebecca Seawright to actually define consent in our penal code. Have you seen the bill, and what do you think of it?
I have actually seen the bill, and I know people who have been active in engaging with her on that. I do think that that there are some serious considerations that have to come into effect. I haven't made I'd have to reread it. I want to make sure that I'm not misstating it in any way, because I remember seeing something especially recently, and someone was holding a sign. It's like, consent means XYZ. And I'm just trying to remember what the actual amendment to the current law is, because I think it's, the current law as it exists from my recollection is that it shouldn't be, it's freely and
Really give a knowledgeable and informed agreement
without coercion or duress, right, or compulsion.
Yeah, forcible compulsion, duress. Let's see, forcible compulsion, duress, coercion,
and then it's like use of
fraud, and artifice.
And hers is proposing the change to what element of it?
Law, so that it applies to every crime. The word consent actually appears.
Are stemming from my.
What's that?
Would you say what, give that phrase?
Sure. You want me to repeat it?
Yes.
Here it is. I wrote it, I should know.
We blipped out for a minute, that's why.
Freely given, knowledgeable and informed agreement. And such agreement has to be provided without the use of malice. Okay, when it's freely given, knowledgeable and informed, it basically, all of that really entails the fact that you can't use malice and claim that it's consent, right? If you did so in a robbery, it's not consent, right? Even Bernie Madoff died in jail because people chased after him to take their money. So, but he lied, right? He lied about everything. Mm-hmm. So they never consented. They were tricked into giving him the money. So if you're forcing the person, if you're tricking the person, if you're coercing the person, then, force, fear, fraud are not elements of consent, right? If force, fear, or fraud exist within that agreement, then that person is actually not consenting. They might be acquiescing, they might be assenting, but they're not consenting. So I just wanted to get Eliza's opinion on it. So what do you think? Because I can tell it to you again, because it's really short. It's
I'm just not sure how that is that definition of consent sounds like the definition.
The only definition of consent. It's freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement.
Right.
What consent is.
Right.
Yeah. And if we don't recognize what it is by law, then you can't prosecute people for having non-consensual sexual contact.
I see. But I understand completely what she's going for there. I just want to, before I take like a hard position on it, I just want to look into it further.
Yeah, well, I'd appreciate you doing so and getting back to me.
I absolutely will. I can send you a video recorded answer so you can amend it to the end of our session if you'd like.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure before I commit. It sounds understandable completely, and based on, you know, my experience as an attorney, as a criminal defense attorney, I'm well aware of consent arguments, and so I just want to, you know.
Well, it's consistent with Model Penal Code. It's consistent with Nuremberg Code. It's consistent with GDPR. So it's not something that we've simply made up. It's
Right.
actually the definition for consent.
Right.
And the word consent appears over 100 times in penal code. So if you're not going to define the word consent, then you have to change that word consent in penal code to something else. What is it that you want if you don't want consent? Because consent is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. That's what it is.
Huh. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine that it's not already defined in
Why argue?
I know, right? It's hard to imagine that that New York does not define consent, and it's like it's something that we talk about constantly, and that's always part of the discussion. And I think that, you know, jurors are really instructed to use your common sense about what consent means, but of course, you know, if there's no explicit definition of it, it should be rectified. So
of course. So yeah, quite frankly,
that's my tentative answer on it.
I can live with that. Okay, because the Constitution of the United States grants all of us equal protection under the law. And if the judge says to each jury, use your common sense, then they can all come up with different concepts of what consent actually means. And we don't have consistency under the law. So folks, I think that we're running out of time here with Eliza. And I want to thank you so much for being here. Ellen, you have one quickie?
One last question. We haven't gotten to the violent crimes, and like, what will you ever put anybody in jail? And what will you do with to reduce gun violence and reduce violent crimes?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. We actually have a gun violence prevention plan that should be up on the website this week, if not this week, certainly early next week. That we've gotten advice from, you know, national gun safety experts, people who are really well versed in this stuff, and it's extremely important. And obviously, you know, reducing gun violence is critical to keeping our community safe. And so, of course, you know, there are times when incarceration is the only answer to certain things. But I think, you know, in terms of gun possession cases, I often tell the story of a young woman I represented, a woman named Jessica. And to call her a woman is actually an exaggeration. She was a teenage girl when I represented her, 16 years old, and charged with possessing a gun. And the Manhattan DA's office wanted only to send this young woman to jail. And we begged and begged, you know, for an alternative to incarceration. And finally, a judge said, okay, well, I'll let her participate in this. She graduated the program with flying colors, you know, became a mentor to other kids, ended up on a completely different path, got youthful offender treatment, so has no criminal record. And, you know, then I was lucky enough 2 years later to speak at her high school graduation, along with the judge on the case, by the way. And this past weekend, I attended her baby shower. And, you know, this is someone who's then been gainfully employed. It's been a decade since I met her and represented her. And so I think, you know, making sure that we don't just default, because it's a gun possession case, that we don't just default to incarceration. You know, she could have faced, you know, a very serious incarceration, and that was not the right outcome. So yes, certain cases, but not all cases. But I think I have to wrap so I can jump onto my other Zoom.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
absolutely. So
thank you so much. Thank you.
thank you very much for being here. I just wanted to let everybody know that our next guest is going to be Mark Levine on Monday, and he's running for borough president. And to remind everybody that your vote is your voice, and we want to hear your voice loud and clear on June 22nd. So I think Eliza had to hop off, and we'll see everybody next week. So thanks for joining us, folks.
Cheers.